Lesson 3. He is not an artist. Mrs. Robinson is in her garden. She is standing near the fence. Fence. She is talking to her neighbor. Her neighbor's name is Mrs. Price. Mrs. Robinson. Good morning, Mrs. Price. Can I borrow your ladder, please? Mrs. Price. Not now, Mrs. Robinson. I can give it to you this afternoon. My husband is using the ladder now. He is upstairs. He is painting. Mrs. Robinson. Mrs. Robinson. Painting? That's a nice hobby. Mrs. Price. Oh, it's not his hobby. Mrs. Robinson. He doesn't like it. Mrs. Robinson. Is your husband painting a picture? Mrs. Price. No, he can't paint pictures. He isn't an artist. Mrs. Robinson. What is he doing? Mrs. Price. He's painting the bedroom. Answer these questions. Part A. 1. Is Mrs. Robinson in her garden? Yes, she is. 2. Is she in her kitchen? No, she is not. 3. Is Mrs. Robinson standing near the fence? Yes, she is. 4. Is Mrs. Robinson talking to Mrs. Price? Yes, she is. 5. Is Mrs. Robinson talking to her husband? No, she is not. 16. Maksudku 6. Does Mrs. Robinson want Mrs. Price's ladder? Mrs. Price's ladder? Yes, she does. Can Mrs. Robinson borrow Mrs. Price's ladder now? No, she cannot. 8. Can she borrow Mrs. Price's ladder this afternoon? Yes, she can. 9. Is Mr. Price using the ladder now? Yes, he is. 10. Is Mr. Price upstairs? Yes, he is. 12. Is he painting? Yes, he is. 12. Is this his hobby? No, this is not. 13. Is Mr. Price an artist? No, he is not. 14. Can he paint pictures? No, he cannot. 15. Is Mr. Price painting the bedroom? Yes, he is. Part B. 16. Is Mrs. Robinson in the kitchen or in the garden? Mrs. Robinson is in the kitchen. 17. Is Mrs. Robinson talking to Mrs. Price or to her husband? Mr. Robinson is talking to Mrs. Price. 18. Does Mrs. Robinson want a ladder or a book? Mrs. Robinson wants a ladder. 19. Can she borrow the ladder this morning or this afternoon? She can borrow the ladder this afternoon. 20. Is Mr. Price upstairs or is he in the garden? Mr. Price is upstairs. 21. Is he painting a picture or is she painting the bedroom? He is painting the bedroom. Part C. 22. What are Mrs. Robinson and Mrs. Price doing? They are talking. 23. What does Mrs. Robinson want? She wants a ladder. 24. What is Mr. Price doing? He is painting.